Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about the causes of the Civil War from a social aspect. This is our third section of notes. So far, we've talked a little bit about the political, the economic. Today we're going to talk about social. Now, what we mean by social is things that make people think a certain way or feel a certain way. In this particular case, things that lead people to think about slavery in ways that kind of lead up to the start of the Civil War. Now, of course, the date that we're kind of focusing on is April 12th, 1861. That is the official start of the war. So just kind of keep that date in mind as we talk about some of the things that have dates that are specific to the things we're going to talk about today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is a book. So the book that has a huge impact on the war. In fact, at one point when the author, Harriet Beecher Stowe, meets President Lincoln reportedly says, "So, you're the lady that wrote that book that started this war," okay? So Harriet Beecher Stowe writes a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, and it is essentially the story about what slave life is like in the South. It's about a runaway slave. It talks about quite a bit of the cruelty and kind of the difficult situation of being a slave. It is a very, very popular book. In the first year that it's published, it sells over 300,000 copies. Now, that'd be a lot of copies today, even more so back in the 1850s when people didn't buy as many books. It was harder to find books. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, it's the second most popular book in the entire 19th century, second only to the Bible, okay? Now, it's not important just because it sells a lot of copies. It's important because it has a major impact on how people view slavery, especially people in the North. So if you're someone living in Connecticut, Massachusetts, Vermont, for example, in the 1850s, you probably don't travel very far away from your home. You know, we're a very mobile society today. We can get on a plane and be anywhere in a couple hours. Back then, people really didn't travel as much, and so you might live your entire life in the North without physically seeing what slavery is like in the southern part of the country with your own eyes. So when you read this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin, you get a sense for what slavery is like. It shows the cruelty of it. And a lot of people in the North begin to really kind of understand or believe they understand what slavery is like in the South. Now, people in the South are going to say this isn't based on an actual autobiography or biography. It's not something that Harriet Beecher Stowe came down to the South and researched. She's a Northerner. So this is a very, very interesting book as far as people reading it, talking about it, and getting a definite feeling about what slavery is like, especially people in the North that had maybe never experienced it on their own. Now, another individual that we're going to talk about here has some local connections, John Brown. Now, we talked about John Brown a little bit with the abolitionist movement notes before. He is a revolutionary abolitionist. He believes that God wants him to end slavery in any way possible, and that includes potentially using violence. 1855, he comes out to Kansas during the whole Bleeding Kansas episode. He wants to help Kansans fight for the creation of a free state when they're allowed to vote on whether they want to be free or slave. He and his sons reportedly killed 5 people here in Kansas that supported slavery. Very, very violent, okay? So that's kind of the John Brown episode of what's happening in Kansas in the mid-1850s. Now, in 1859, he leads an attack on an arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, okay? Now, this is important because John Brown believes that if he can get enough guns and ammunition, he can lead a slave revolt that's going to expand and eventually end slavery in the entire United States. He just needs the firepower to do it. So Brown and several of his sons, several followers, go and they try and capture all of the guns at Harper's Ferry. Now, the raid fails. Brown is eventually captured because he has attacked a federal arsenal. He is charged with treason, sentenced to hang, and he's viewed as either being a martyr by the abolitionists, which means somebody that is willing to die for a worthy cause, or a terrorist by people in the South. So he's a very polarizing figure. People either see him as being great or essentially almost being evil. He is executed on December 2nd, 1859, and there's songs that are written about his death. There's all kinds of books, and people write about it. There's poems. There's a lot of debate following about whether he is a martyr or whether he is essentially a terrorist. So a very important figure in this time period, again executed in December of 1859. We're getting pretty close to the start of the actual war at this point. This is a famous mural that is in the Capitol in Kansas. John Brown is at the center of this mural. It shows all the turmoil. You can see the American flag and the Confederate flag. John Brown is holding a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other, demonstrating both his desire to be a follower of God, but also wanting to use violence to basically end slavery. You see soldiers from both sides here at his feet. You see fires, tornadoes. So this is a very famous mural. It's even appeared on different album covers for rock bands and things. And even in popular culture today, this is at a Kansas game, and instead of the Bible, they've put a national championship trophy there. So this is a very famous image of John Brown, a very controversial image of John Brown as well. Now, we've talked a little bit about the abolition movement already, but there is a movement to help slaves that have escaped from slavery in the South eventually get to the North. It's called the Underground Railroad. It's not technically a railroad, but rather a network of safe houses and people that will eventually help runaway slaves get to safety in the North. Here's a couple of maps. Again, before the Fugitive Slave Act, if you could get to a free state, essentially in many ways you were considered to be free at that point. There's a variety of different secret codes that the Underground Railroad used. A lot of times they moved at night to try and protect identities. Very dangerous and very risky. Now, one of the people that's considered a conductor on the Underground Railroad is Harriet Tubman. She's a former abused slave. She escapes to Philadelphia in 1849, and the amazing thing about Harriet Tubman's story is she's able to escape and get to freedom, but then that's not enough for Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman decides to go back and helps other slaves that are escaped eventually get their freedom. So she's risking her own freedom by going back and forth to try and help other runaway slaves get their freedom in the North as well. She's known as the Moses of her people. There's a lot of estimates. I don't know exactly how many people technically. Some technical estimates say 70 slaves, 13 different trips. I've also seen that people have estimated she's helped, literally hundreds of slaves potentially get their freedom. But she's a really amazing individual. She was also a Union spy in the Civil War. She led an attack of Union forces, essentially becoming the first woman ever to lead a military expedition in U.S. history. And the South was constantly trying to capture her. They had a huge bounty out. If you could capture Harriet Tubman, you'd get a huge reward, and they just could never capture her. All right, Frederick Douglass, another former slave. He escapes in 1838. He was taught to read and write as a child. Technically, that was against the law at the time. But he goes on a lot of different speaking tours. He writes an autobiography in 1845, describes his life as a slave. Amazingly, one of the things that comes out about Frederick Douglass is he writes this really amazing autobiography. He's a great public speaker. And a lot of people said that African Americans at this point of time should not be taught to read and write because they didn't have the mental capacity to be able to do that. And Frederick Douglass just completely blows that out of the water. He's educated, he's fluent, he is an amazing speaker, he writes, so he is really an inspiration to a lot of people in the abolition movement. Very active, gets involved in politics, is very vocal about what's happening with the abolition movement. All right, William Lloyd Garrison, he's an abolitionist who contributes to the cause by publishing a newspaper in Boston called The Liberator. And this really becomes the newspaper for the abolitionist movement. People are using it to communicate and talk, and it's a way for people to spread information. People eventually that are pro-slavery supporters try and burn down his offices. They take his printing press and destroy it. There's been attacks at his house, all kinds of things. So he is somebody that's contributed in a different way to the abolitionist movement. So those are just kind of a sampling of some of the things that are happening socially. Again, when you put all these things together, We talked about the question at the beginning of this unit, what is the root cause of the Civil War? Yes, you could say slavery, but that's also a very simplistic answer, and we've tried to really get into kind of some of the more advanced kind of reasons why the Civil War eventually starts in 1861. All right, so that is the social causes of the Civil War.